and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale the Real Seeker, and today we have a special treat for you guys. It's actually a first for me. So I have my old professor from last semester, Dr. Michael Milona. Hey, Mike.
Hopefully I'm not that old yet, but yeah. Hey, Dale, how are you doing?
Good, I'm good, thank you. So yeah, for those of you that don't know, Mike taught me the philosophy of emotions last semester, and as my audience will know, I kind of had a reputation for not taking emotions seriously at all. I was very strict into just intellectual arguments and that sort of thing. So Mike is the guy who kind of changed my mind to saying, well, maybe there's a little bit more here to take seriously. So yeah, with that said, Mike, I'll turn it straight over to you to just sort of give us an introduction as to who you are, your association with the philosophy of emotions, and if you don't mind, maybe give us a bit of your faith journey, where you stand religiously or
sure.
Cool.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just give the personal stuff first. So I'm originally from the States. I grew up in a town called Roanoke in the Appalachian Mountains in Virginia, and I spent the first period of my life there in Virginia, and then I would eventually go off to do my PhD in Los Angeles, the University of Southern California, where I worked primarily on metaethics and emotions, and did my dissertation under Professor Mark Schroeder there. Then I went to Cornell for a year to do a postdoc, and I taught for a while in Alabama at Auburn University, and have now more recently found my way to Ryerson here in Toronto, and hopefully to stay. Yeah. And as far as the faith end, that can get complicated pretty quickly, but I'll try to keep it short. So I grew up Christian, I grew up Methodist, and so I went to church every Sunday. I loved praying. I would pray for like 10 to 30 minutes every night, and I found a lot of meaning in that. But I think for me, I experienced like tremendous suffering of someone who was close to me, and that really ended up shaking my faith in a non-philosophical kind of way. It was before I was into philosophy, around 16, 17, and sort of slowly eroded my religious framework. And so that was like a very hard period of my life, and I would often return, like when I would go to college, I would sort of return to church occasionally, and I wasn't able to sort of rekindle sort of what I once had. So there was a sense of tremendous loss in a certain respect. And reading Plato and Aristotle and these philosophers was a thing that kind of helped me get through that to the extent that I have. But yeah, I sort of had my sort of world turned upside down through that period of my life, and I think it would be misleading to cast it as like, oh, I was concerned with the problem of evil or something like that. That's way more sophisticated than anything that I was thinking about at the time. And when I think about religious arguments now, I can find myself often going back and forth one way or the other, but there's a sense in which I can't recapture what I once had, that kind of faith. That's a short story, kind of a sad one, but there it is. Yeah. So should I say a little bit about emotions or
how do you get into the philosophy of emotions?
Yeah, so there's I think a couple things that got me into it. So I was primarily interested in metaethics, questions about the nature of morality, moral epistemology in grad school. And I came across this argument from J.L. Mackie that started, Mackie, if readers are familiar, was an error theorist, a nihilist. Maybe we'll end up talking about that at some point later in this discussion, but kind of doubted ethics as we ordinarily conceive of it. And part of what he doubted was the possibility of a plausible epistemology of ethics. And he sort of complained that we'd have to have this weird faculty of intuition in order to grasp ethical truths. And at the same time, I was reading, dipping my toes into this emotions literature, and a big idea that a lot of emotion theorists have is that emotions are a kind of experience of value, a way of seeing the world as significant in various ways. And so I thought that maybe that could be a way to help with Mackey's challenge to kind of get moral epistemology off the ground, to have something like a moral experience, as it were, in much the way that you might have a perceptual experience to get science and empirical inquiry off the ground. So that was one thing. And I was also just puzzled by the way in which people would talk about emotions in a more pre-theoretical sense. So you would hear people say things like, oh, like use your gut or rely on your gut, and that as if that were a good thing. And then people would also complain about people relying too much on their emotions, or as if their emotions were going to just distract them and be this wholly misleading thing. We need to get rid of our emotions as much as possible. And I think that might be a little bit where you were at, perhaps at one point. And so trying to find are emotions something that's potentially helpful, or are they this harmful distraction that's kind of getting in the way of good inquiry? And how do we think through the role that emotion should be playing in different kinds of inquiry? So those were the two things that kind of drove me into emotion theory.
Awesome. All right, cool. Yeah, and it was interesting about your kind of your faith journey. So I think that's for a lot of people, that it's the emotional problem of evil that really drives them and that sort of thing, rather than a strict logical, premise one, premise two. They don't go through that. It's mostly the emotional thing that drives them to lose faith and that sort of thing. So
yeah, and I've also been the kind of person that has never, I should say, confidently held philosophical positions to the degree to which other philosophers seem to confidently hold their philosophical positions. So there's a way in which maybe I'm not the best philosopher who's just holds my positions with really firm conviction, in metaethics. When I read arguments about the problem of evil, I can kind of find myself swaying one way or the other in the moment. But it's almost as if there's this underlying faith that I can't recapture.
Yeah. All right, fair enough. So yeah, with that said, let's get straight into the philosophy of emotions then. So yeah, the first question, this is the first thing you did with us in our grad seminar for lecture one. Okay, let's get a sense of what are emotions. What exactly are they? What kind of features do they have? How do they relate to other states of the mind, that sort of thing? So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, great. So this is one point at which it could be useful if I share a document really quickly. It's really a fairly sloppy document, but it might help.
Sure.
Do you care if I do that?
Yeah, go ahead. I set it up so you
can. Okay, cool. So hopefully this is the right document. Yeah. Can you see that?
Yeah. Phenomenology.
Yeah. So the way philosophers often start theorizing the emotions is listing what they think to be the key features of emotions. And so that's what I'm doing here. Now, I should say before we get going, that there's different ways of talking about the emotions. So we can talk about emotions as an experience that someone is having at a given moment. So if there's a bear charging you and you're afraid of the bear, there's an immediate experiential response that you're having that we would call fear in that case. But we could also say, fairly enough, that I'm afraid of bears even when I'm asleep. And what we mean by that is that there's a disposition to be afraid of bears under certain conditions. And that's not the sense, that kind of dispositional sense is not usually the primary target of the philosophy of emotions. Philosophers of emotions tend to be interested in that the experiential aspect of emotions. And it also raises questions about whether there can be unconscious emotions, say, for example. But sort of setting that aside, it's these conscious experiences that philosophers tend to be primarily interested in. And so I've listed here what some of the key features are supposed to be. And some of these are controversial, but the idea is that one should try to give a theory of emotions that captures these features. So the first I've listed here is phenomenology. And so this is just the idea that there's something it's like to experience an emotion. And there's several different dimensions to this. So the first one here is passivity. So we often say that we're overcome with anger or we're struck with fear. So we don't simply choose to have an emotion. The way we experience emotions is as of something happening to us. Emotions also typically involve bodily sensations. So we might feel our heart rate increasing. We might feel our body being primed to act in certain kinds of ways, depending upon the emotion in question. So there's things happening in our body that we're experiencing. And there's also typically hedonic sensations, and hedonic here meaning pleasure and pain. So there's a kind of pain perhaps that's involved in fear, or at least a negative sensation involved in fear. There's a positive sensation involved in joy. So there's this kind of valence that emotions have, positive or negative. And philosophers often say that there's an evaluative phenomenology to emotions. So a sad person, a person who's grieving the loss of a parent, say, may say that it feels like a tremendous loss, or a fearful person might say that the snarling dog seems really dangerous. So there's these different dimensions of phenomenology. So that's one aspect, or really a collection of different aspects that we might want a theory of emotions to explain. There's also this weird term that philosophers use called intentionality. And so this roughly means aboutness or directedness. And so a lot of mental states that we have this feature. So if you believe that Paris is in France, then somehow you have this belief that's about Paris and about France. And our emotions also seem to be directed at things and about things. So for example, if you're afraid of the dog, then in some sense your fear is about the dog. If you're angry at somebody for stomping on your toe, then your anger is about them stomping on your toe. And so these things where we say like you're angry at such and such, or you're afraid of such and such, or you're happy about such and such, these are what philosophers often call the particular objects of the emotions. But emotions are often also thought to have formal objects. And the formal objects are kind of the values that are associated with the given emotion in question. So for example, fear seems to be associated with the value of danger. And value here is being used in a broad sense to cover good things and bad things. So fear seems to somehow be about danger. Anger somehow seems to be about being slighted or being wronged. And so these different emotions we have also seem to somehow concern values. And one of the big questions in emotion theory is how these formal objects exactly relate to emotional experiences. And there's a lot of different theories about how that works. Lastly, here we have this category that I'm calling just evaluation. And that's that we seem to evaluate our emotions in a number of different ways. So we can evaluate them as correct or incorrect, fitting or unfitting, sometimes is language that gets used here. So if, here's an example to illustrate. Suppose that someone's at a funeral and they tell a joke that's a funny joke. And in some sense we'd say like, that's not the joke, like that's not something you should be doing right now. But there's also a sense in which the joke is funny. And so it's in a certain sense, like laughing at the joke would be getting it right, because the joke is a funny joke. Even though all things considered, you shouldn't laugh at the joke. So like there seems to be this way in which emotions, in this case like humor or laughter, have correctness conditions that are internal to the emotion itself, which seems to have something to do with the value that the emotion is about. So the humor here seems to concern specifically the funniness of the joke. And emotions can also be justified or unjustified, a lot of philosophers think. So it might be that someone who's like very untrustworthy, tells you that you got the job, and then you feel like great joy at getting the job. In some sense, your emotion is not justified because this person is untrustworthy. So there you have an unjustified emotion, even though it's still a correct emotion. So the category of being correct and being justified seem to be different ways in which we evaluate the emotion. Okay, so that's a lot.
No,
Dale, do you have anything that I can further clarify there?
yeah, no, I think that was pretty helpful, especially with the visual image for the audience. They got sort of the three main categories of expressing the features of emotion and that sort of thing. I guess what I think would be helpful is, okay, so you've kind of described some of the features of emotions. How does that compare and contrast with other states of mind? Things like moods, for example.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Great. So with moods, there's going to be some similarities, especially when it comes to the phenomenological dimension. So a lot of philosophers are going to think, yeah, there's a kind of passivity to moods, there's bodily sensations involved in moods, there's hedonic sensations. And I should just give a couple examples of moods so that we know what I'm talking about. So I'm talking about things like melancholy, euphoria, depression, elation, these kinds of phenomena. But what a lot of philosophers also think is that there are some features that emotions have that moods don't have. So sometimes philosophers say that moods lack an object altogether. So if someone is feeling euphoric, maybe there's a way in which you can feel euphoric about something, but there also seems to be a sense in which a person could feel euphoric just not about anything at all. And in that sense, if that's possible, then you have an emotion-like state that we're calling a mood here that has no object whatsoever. And so the intentional dimension falls out of the picture, some philosophers think. And some also think that because there's no intentionality, there's no aboutness, there's no directedness to moods, there's also no sense in which moods can be correct or incorrect. They just are some kind of experience that you're having that can't be itself evaluated. So there you have a lot of the phenomenology that's present in moods, but according to some, the intentionality and the evaluation are dropping out of the picture.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So one thing that you mentioned, I'm interested in the intentionality bit. So that's a major difference between emotions and another affective state like moods. But you mentioned that there are some philosophers that think that no, well, actually moods can be intentional as well. You want to maybe tell the audience what they think?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's different views about the sense in which moods might be intentional. So some philosophers think that moods are intentional in that they take a very broad object. So they might encompass the entire world. So when you feel euphoric, it's not that your euphoria isn't about anything at all. It's just not about something specific. It's about the world is wonderful, say. That's what intention is about. So the content, the aboutness is the world is wonderful. Or melancholy might be something similar to that, but the world is evaluated as negative in some kind of way. So you might have this idea that moods take everything, like the entire world, as their object. There's a view that's similar to that, which is actually compatible with that view, where it's not that the mood is always taking the entire world as the object, but that it's hopping from wherever your attention is focused at that moment. So if you're feeling euphoric, then it's like whatever you sort of focus on at that time seems wonderful. So if you're at a party and you're feeling euphoric, then whoever you focus on just seems great. The drinks seem great, the music seems great, and you're just hopping from one item to the next, and it's indiscriminate in that way. So those are two views about moods, and you could actually think that some moods work in the sense of taking the whole world as their object, other moods work in the sense of hopping from one thing to the next thing. And the interesting thing about those two views, if you could get a picture of moods like that to work, then you'll have a fairly unified picture of emotions and moods, where moods were just a special class of emotions rather than this radically different thing altogether, as some philosophers think. So it makes the picture neater and simpler in some ways, but potentially false. I could say more there, but I'll stop for a moment. If you want to jump in.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. That I was just gonna ask. So where do you stand personally on that question, if you don't mind me asking?
So I like that picture, and I'll tell you why I like that picture. So I'm not 100% convinced of it, but here's why I like it. So I think that when it comes to ordinary emotions, like fear, anger, and so on, there's a way in which those emotions feel that has a lot to do with what those emotions are about. So how does fear get to be about danger? How does it get to be associated with danger? I think it has something to do with the phenomenology of fear. The experience of fear itself is a kind of experience that couldn't be about anything other than danger, as it were. And if you think that, and a lot of philosophers will agree to this, even philosophers who think that moods are not about anything at all. But if you think that, there's this very tight connection between the way in which we experience an emotion and the values that those emotions are about. And then you transfer over to moods, and let's say, like, instead of having an emotion of fear, you have a fearful mood. It would be very odd to think, okay, the phenomenology of fear, which is associated with danger, explains how fear gets to be about danger. But then you have this very similar phenomenal state. This feels a lot like fear, it just doesn't feel about anything specific. That somehow has nothing to do with danger. So having that kind of asymmetry makes me uncomfortable and makes me want to try to develop an account of moods that is going to get them to be about something. And I just think that there might not be a unified answer to, like, moods could be the indiscriminate possibility, they could be the whole world possibility. And there's another possibility, which I haven't mentioned, that I think could also happen in some cases. And that's the idea that a mood could be, and this is a position that is defended recently by Angela Mendelevici, I think at Western University. And she thinks that moods are sometimes about uninstantiated properties. So when you experience, like, a fearful mood, it just represents danger, just like danger as such. And I think some moods could work like that. So, like, you could have an experience of euphoria that could just represent wonderfulness, but not attach it to anything in particular. And so I think different moods might work differently, but I want something like this picture to work because I think it makes for the most unified story about the connection between phenomenology and intentionality, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. But just about to say that makes sense. For the audience as well, because I remember you posted up a great YouTube video of kind of a discussion between Mendelevici and was Amy Kind?
Amy Kind, yeah.
So I'll post that up for people who are interested in this moods intentionality thing. But yeah, for the moment, back to you there, Mike. Okay, great. So you've given us kind of an idea of what emotions and moods are and that sort of thing. Okay, what are some of the theories in terms of the structure of emotions themselves? What do people think that the emotions are?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the idea or the name of the game is to come up with some account of what an emotion is such that it can do all the things that I mentioned. Capture the phenomenological aspects of emotion, capture the intentional aspects and the evaluative aspects of emotion. So one view of emotions that goes all the way back to William James, it's actually often called Jamesianism, says that what an emotion is the experience of your body changing in certain ways. Okay. So this is really privileging the bodily sensation aspect of emotion. So when you feel sad, for example, James will say, you don't feel sad and then cry because you're sad. Rather, you feel sad because you experience yourself as crying. So it's kind of reversing how we might ordinarily think about that. The sadness is the experience of your body undergoing the changes that we typically associate with sadness. Or joy is an experience of your body undergoing changes that we typically associate with joy. So we've seen a very tight connection on the Jamesian picture between emotions and the bodily sensations that we typically associate with emotions. So this argument is often, or this view is often motivated by a kind of subtraction argument. So it sort of says, imagine that emotions didn't have bodily sensation. Would we still think that the emotion was there? And the Jamesian says no. Imagine that anything else we might associate with emotions went away, but the bodily sensation was still there. Then it seems like we would say that the emotion is still there. So that the core feature of an emotion on this view is the sensation of bodily changes. Jamesians also like this view because it seems to make sense of how animals could experience emotions too. And so as we'll see, some other theories of emotions make emotions into fairly sophisticated states that we might doubt that animals could also experience. But it seems like animals could also be afraid, they could be sad. And so the bodily feelings version of an emotion theory seems to make sense of how that could be. Right. Yeah, so that's one view. That view is often resisted because it doesn't seem to make sense of the intentionality of emotions and the way in which emotions can be correct or incorrect. So yeah, I'm feeling some changes happen in my body, but my emotion is about, say, the death of a parent. But how are the sensations in my body? Like, that's the only kind of intentionality that the Jamesian view seems to be directly explaining. It also seems that, you could correctly experience that there are certain changes in your body, but that doesn't seem to have to do with the way in which we ordinarily think about the correctness of emotions, where that has to do with, like, is the thing I'm afraid of really dangerous or not? Not, am I actually experiencing this change in my body? So for that reason, a lot of philosophers have been pushed away from the Jamesian theory, although there's sophisticated ways of trying to make it work.
Yeah, I think in our class, well, a lot of the students kind of were, and I know myself, we were kind of resistant to that view as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so then another view that you've got is judgmentalism. Mm-hmm. And so a judgmentalist view is going to say that what an emotion really is a kind of judgment, a special kind of judgment. And so this is a view that's been defended by Martha Nussbaum, Robert Solomon, among others. And the idea here is that this view can really explain how emotions are about things, because judgment is a paradigmatically intentional state. It can also explain how values get into the picture, because you just have, say, a judgment of loss is what constitutes sadness. So Martha Nussbaum gives the example of experiencing the death of her mother, and she just sort of asks, could you judge that this person who's so significant to you is now gone from your life, that's sort of ripped out of your world, and that your world is just now radically changed at the loss of this person? Could you make that judgment and not experience an emotion? And she thinks the answer is no. And furthermore, it's the activity of assenting to the loss of one's mother that has like the kinetic force that constitutes the emotion itself, a kind of psychic force. So she sees, on this picture, she sees bodily sensations as something that's really secondary. That's not an essential ingredient of emotion. So like, if we go back to that list of features, then the judgmentalist will often just cross out the bodily aspect and just say that's not really essential to it. Like, you could get rid of that. But there's this kind of psychic activity of, in the case of sadness, assenting to loss, or in the case of fear, assenting to something as being dangerous. And that assent is the judgment that constitutes the emotion in question. And so this view is often thought to struggle with the feeling or phenomenological aspects of emotion. And there's, as I've kind of indicated here, there's ways in which they try to capture that by sort of talking about reason as an activity, judgment as an activity. But it does really well when it comes to the intentional aspects, the aboutness aspects, and the evaluative aspects, because emotions can be correct or incorrect. They can be rational or irrational. So as you're kind of seeing here, it's trying to get everything in the picture is a tall task. So then the last view I'll mention is what's often called the perceptual theory. And the perceptual theory comes out of historically a critique of the judgment theory. And so consider the following kinds of cases, which are often called recalcitrant emotions. So someone is, let's say, afraid of a little spider, and the spider happens to not be poisonous, and let's just suppose that its fangs are not even such that they could even pierce human skin. So the spider is utterly harmless, and the person knows that the spider is harmless, and yet they still experience this fear reaction. And it's, if anything is fear, that response is fear. And what a lot of philosophers have said is that doesn't feel like a judgment that you're in danger. It feels like something that's more perception-like, that you don't have control over, in the same way that when you experience a visual illusion, you may know that it's an illusion, but you're still experiencing it that way. But you're not judging that things are the way that the visual experience is presenting as being. So like, let's say you go to see a ventriloquist. It's not like you believe that the puppet is talking, but you experience the puppet as talking. And so this has led a lot of philosophers to think that really emotions are more like a perception than they are a judgment. And a lot of philosophers have also thought that this can help with the phenomenological difficulties that the judgmentalist view runs into, because perceptions, like if you think of, perceiving an odor through like olfactory perception, or perceiving a color through visual perception, there's a very strong phenomenological aspect to that. Like you see something as red, like there's a strong experiential dimension to that. And so the thought has been that the perceptual view might be able to make sense of the phenomenological aspects of emotions better than the judgmentalist view, and better deal with these kind of cases of recalcitrance. But I'll mention, even though I'll put my hand up as someone who's defended perceptualism in print, but the perceptualist view does have problems. And so one problem is that it struggles a little bit, not with the correctness or incorrectness of emotions, but with the justification aspect of emotions. So if we think that emotions can be justified or unjustified, then it sounds like, well, perceptions can't be unjustified or unjustified. Like you wouldn't typically say, like, when you see a visual illusion, that you're unjustified in seeing it that way. So it looks like the perceptualist is going to struggle with the capturing this idea that emotions can be justified or unjustified.
Gotcha.
So yeah.
Oh, sorry. All right, cool. Yeah. So do you think that is maybe more of an issue though of justification? Like maybe there might be some other thing, like for example, I go with warrant and stuff. We just did a show on epistemology, so my audience is well familiar with this. So
yeah.
Do you think that's more of an issue for like justification per se?
It might be. So I think that my own view is that we have kind of vexed intuitions about whether emotions as such can be justified or unjustified, and maybe there's an adjacent notion that's not quite justification that can apply to emotions and perceptions. But kind of the game that is going to get played here is going to be, okay, is there a way in which we can evaluate emotions? What is that way? And is that way also a way that applies to paradigm perceptual experiences? And if the answer to that is no, is that going to be a problem for the judgmentalist, the perceptualist? Or is the perceptualist going to be able to say, like, well, there are these special kind of perceptions where that sort of evaluation, perhaps warrant, can apply to. And so that's sort of the game that gets played here. And some philosophers might just want to, resist that emotions themselves can be justified or unjustified, to try to avoid that problem. Because, if we go back to that list of things that I laid out at the beginning, that shouldn't be taken as inflexible, as if they're things that can't be contested. Gotcha.
All right, cool. Okay, so there is one thing I'm going to take you to task here for. You missed one.
Sure.
So there's a fourth theory of emotions that and the reason I want you to cover that is because that's the one originally I kind of leaned towards perceptualism myself, and I changed my mind to the fourth one, attitudinalism. So do you mind just explaining what that is?
Yeah, so the attitudinalist is going to say that, or let me say another feature of perceptualism, because attitudinalism, just as perceptualism emerges out of critique of judgmentalism, attitudinalism is supposed to emerge out of a critique of perceptualism. And so the perceptualist says that emotions are about value, in the sense that if we ask what fear is, it is an experience of something as being dangerous. In the same way that a perception of a red square is an experience as of a square as red. And what the attitudinalist says is that, well, fear is a kind of evaluative experience, but it doesn't have evaluative content. It is the attitude itself, the emotion of fear, that is itself a kind of experience of danger. And so there's different ways to develop this idea, but the view that we talked about in the class is a view according to which in experiencing emotion, like say fear, you feel your body being primed to act in a way that would be correct in light of the relevant value. So in fear, you feel your body being primed to act in such a way that would be correct if the particular object of your fear, say the dog, really were dangerous. But it's not as if the fear is about danger. The fear itself is a kind of dangerous qualified experience. So the attitudinalist picture is sees the relation between emotions and values as a little bit like the relationship between belief and truth. So when you believe that P, that's not the same as believing that P is true, but in some sense, truth characterizes the correctness conditions of the belief, right? It's somehow belief is a truth-oriented attitude. And so in the same way, fear is a danger-oriented attitude, sadness is a loss-oriented attitude, but it's not as if being sad at the loss of a parent represents the parent's death as a loss. It's that sadness itself is a way of feeling your body primed to respond to loss. That would be correct only if the object of your sadness were a loss. So the attitudinalist view it's trying to combine in a very strong way, like aspects of the Jamesian theory, right? The feeling your body sort of primed to do certain things, and aspects of the evaluative aspects of the perceptualist view, and kind of get them all into a package that somehow works. And sometimes it can seem like the view is kind of bursting at the seams to kind of make sense of how all this comes together. But maybe you'll have some follow-up questions. It's hard to explain in a short space.
Yeah, no, I think you did a great job in that one. One thing I would want to say though is it? I know the version we studied from Milona and Tironi there involved these bodily reactions and that sort of thing. But do you think that attitudinalism has to take that? Like, because I think we could experience emotions as attitude, even disembodied and that sort of thing. So good. And I should say that when Diana and Tironi talk about the bodily sensations, they call it a gestalt of bodily sensations. So it's not like you're experiencing discrete, like my heart is racing. It's like the bodily sensations all come together as a kind of unified package. So they kind of try to distance themselves from Jamesianism in that sense. But they also mentioned at one point that perhaps you could have a disembodied version of like some maybe, or there might be some emotions that don't really have feelings of your body changing anyway. Like if you're content, it's like, what are the bodily sensations involved in being content or in regretting something? When we regret something, it doesn't seem like we're primed to act in any way necessarily. And so they do suggest that perhaps you can have the attitudinal theory without feelings of your body's readiness to act. They don't really develop that idea, but I think in principle that space is open to be developed. I think you're right. Cool. Awesome. All right. So yeah, I think that covers everything that I had in terms of questioning the first aspect. What is the nature of emotion? What are some theories about them? Just before we shift focus to going to your main interest of morality, is there anything else about emotions in general that you wanted to say before we move on to morality?
I think, yeah, I mean, certainly nothing that I said was exhaustive. There's certainly much more than the four theories of emotions that we discussed here. There are some theories of emotions that deny that emotions are intentional at all, which is more extreme than even the Jamesian view. So there's other views out there, but I think that the views that we mentioned, and especially you bringing in the attitudinalist view at the end, captures the main set of theories, and other theories tend to be offshoots from critiques of the four theories that we discussed. So I think that was reasonably exhaustive. But yeah.
Cool. All right. So yeah, let's shift focus onto morality then.
Sure.
As you said, this was your main interest. This is what got you into the emotions field to begin with. So yeah, maybe do you want to just sort of explain a little bit about some of the various moral ontologies that are out there, and then where do you fit in? What's your theory of moral ontology there?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this because in a way I've been thinking about other issues for so long now that I'm finally going to get back to this next semester. I'm going to teach a seminar on metaethics.
Oh,
okay. So as far as like moral ontologies go, I mean, certainly here we could go on forever, but like I did with emotions, I'll break them up into three categories. So you could have, of course, a nihilist view. You could think that there are no moral properties or facts at all, no facts about rightness or wrongness, goodness or badness. And while this is a view that haunts me in certain respects, I think that it prima facie has some real problems. One of them is that you might be more confident that say torturing babies is wrong than I am of any philosophical theory that defends nihilism. So that's one thing. And you might also think that there's also, like, if the nihilist puts forward an argument for their view and says, we should believe that this nihilist position is correct, then it seems like they've invoked some normative fact about what we should believe, right? You should believe this nihilist theory on the basis of this argument. But then I wonder, why are facts about what I should believe any weirder than facts about what I should do? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so nihilism is a view that, I think has a number of like interesting things going for it, is ultimately not a view that attracts me for these kinds of reasons. So I'm generally interested in developing moral epistemologies on the assumption of some kind of realist picture of morality.
I'll just say good choice on that.
Yeah. And so realist pictures can, of course, come in a number of different varieties. And I'll just break them up into reductive realist views and non-reductive realist views. So a reductive realist view is going to analyze, say, normative properties, facts about what's right or wrong, good or bad, into, say, descriptive properties or non-natural properties, but analyze them into some other set of properties and sort of locate the normative facts as a subset of these other properties. And so that could go in a number of different ways. So it could be that facts about what I have reason to do somehow reduced to facts about what I desire, say, on one possible view. Or facts about what I would desire under certain ideal conditions that get specified. Or they could even reduce to divine, like you'd have like a theological voluntarist view that was a reductivist view, where, say, what it is to be wrong reduces to facts about what God forbids us from doing. Now, there's versions of theological voluntarism that aren't reductive, but you could have a reductive version of the view where facts about what God commands are what wrongness consists in, or what rightness consists in.
So that's kind of like the straightforward divine command that most people, skeptics, think about when they use it.
Yeah, so you could have a view that's one version of a kind of theological voluntarist view. You could also have a view on which, like certainly I presume any Christian would believe that whatever God commands you to do, or God would command you to do something if and only if it's the right thing to do. And of course, that's not saying that what wrongness or what rightness consists in is what God commands you to do. Or you can have a view on which wrongness is something, or wrongness and rightness are something separate from what God commands, but that God's commands explain why certain things are right or wrong. So that there's a necessary connection, and even an explanatory link between them, but not a reductive link.
Okay.
So there's a lot of different, and that would be, I think, a divine command theory of a sort, but it wouldn't be a reductive divine command theory. But you could have a view in which, like to be the property of being wrong, like when we say, you know, hey, those kids over there burning that cat, to take Gilbert Harmon's famous example, those kids standing around that barrel burning that cat are doing something wrong. We say, like, what is the property of being wrong? Well, one possible view is that it's being such that God has commanded not to do that.
Gotcha.
And so you can have reductive views that are going to reduce them to like human responses or ideal human responses or even divine responses. And so there's a lot of, you could also have a view that said, take another example, take like a kind of utilitarian reductive view. So someone might say the property of being good just is, in its nature, the property of contributing to overall happiness. But you could also have a non-reductive version of that view where you say that something is good if and only if it contributes to overall happiness, but that being good and contributing to overall happiness are different properties. They're just a necessary connection between them. Does that difference make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good. And so, yeah, you have these like reductive views, and then you have non-reductive views, where you would say, like, look, there might be necessary connections between the descriptive and the normative, but that they're two different categories. It's not as if you can analyze the normative properties in terms of any descriptive property. Now, you might be able to analyze some normative properties into other normative properties. So it might be that the property of being rightness analyzes into what you have most reason to do. So like you have all these reasons, and these reasons are normative facts, and then what it is to be right is for the action to be favored by the balance of reasons. And that could be a reductive account of rightness. But then when you get to reasons might be the fundamental normative fact that don't reduce to anything else. And so I guess I am attracted to non-reductive views in ethics, somewhat for similar reasons that I'm attracted to non-reductive views about consciousness, not because in principle I think a reductive view couldn't work, but I haven't seen any that hasn't felt as if it's left something out. So whenever I look at a reductive view of consciousness, I think that doesn't seem to capture what consciousness is. And whenever I've looked at a reductive view of what a normative property is, say in terms of desires, it has seemed to leave something out, namely the normativity or the oughtness of it. Like when you try to put a normative property in descriptive terms, it's like you lose the oughtness or the normativity of what you're trying to capture. And so I've never felt comfortable with a reductive view. And so, yeah, I've been attracted to non-reductive views. I'm sometimes tempted by views that analyze, that don't see all normative properties as irreducible, but to the extent that we can reduce normative properties, they reduce into each other, right? So rightness reducing to reasons, things like that. How much sense does all that make?
Yeah,
Can I clarify anything?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. What I would say, just for my audience, so my audience is both Christians and skeptics and some Muslims and stuff like that. So I think they would be most familiar with terms like, do you believe in objective or subjective morality or moral truths and that sort of thing? So like, I get what your position is, but like, yeah, what would you say you fall on those terms?
So if we say objective, so here's a paradigm. You could tell me how you're thinking of objective. When I think of objective, I think of like whatever beliefs I have about ethics are not necessarily true. Ethics also isn't simply a function of whatever responses I happen to have. And so I think that whatever the ethical domain is, it better be something that allows individuals to be very wrong about ethics. And it also better be something that allows entire cultures to be very wrong about ethics. So when the United States had legalized slavery, they were getting something tremendously wrong. And, then there was progress that was made. And so I think that the ethical is objective in the sense that that what you believe about ethics is not necessarily right. What your culture approves of or believes in about ethics is also not necessarily going to be right. So how does that sound, or would you want to define objective and subjective in different kinds of ways?
So no, I think you kind of covered it, right? Like the simplistic way. So you would fall on the objective end, and it just means there's a mind independent fact. It's not dependent on anyone's beliefs or desires or that sort of thing. Any individual's beliefs or desires or cultures, beliefs and desires. There's an objective fact. Torturing innocent babies for fun is wrong. That's what that means, kind of thing.
Yeah, good. And I do think that there's some trickiness. I purposely avoided the language of mind independence, although I see why that language is also helpful, because you might think that in some sense the normative facts do concern minds. Because torture is partly bad because it relates in a certain way to sensations that people are experiencing. But even if the moral has to do with our responses, or like our like emotions or feelings, or animals' emotions or feelings, or at least partly to do with that, there's still the idea that we could be deeply wrong about the nature of those moral facts that do connect to experiences that people have. So sometimes like carving out like what the mind independence exactly is becomes a bit tricky. But I do agree that we want to say that, look, we can be very wrong about this stuff.
Gotcha.
If that helps. So
Yeah, cool. All right. I guess one last thing on this before we kind of get into the moral epistemology proper, but so I bet that you're probably going to disagree with this, but I gave my notion is that I don't even necessarily care about objective or subjective distinction. For me, the most important thing is that these moral truths or facts are logically necessary. And I think that's what a lot of people are aiming for when they say, well, you have to believe in this transcendent morality. So, I kind of aim that I think moral truths are logically necessary. They're not contingent, or they may involve factual contingencies and stuff like that. But yeah, what's your notion of something like that?
Yeah, so I wonder, are you distinguishing between a kind of logical necessity and a metaphysical necessity? Or are you seeing those as kind of the same category?
Oh, so yeah, the way I said it here, I was kind of using them synonymous.
Yeah. So then I would probably in my own head want to separate those two categories. So I think that it's logically possible, like, so to take like a hard moral case, the Sophie's Choice type example. So you have, she's sort of, the Nazis sort of put this question. I shouldn't have picked this example because I don't know if I'm remembering exactly right, but the Nazis kind of put this choice to her. It's like, okay, so, pick one of your children to be saved or we're kill them both.
Yeah.
I think that it's logically, like, where I say logically, like, I mean, consistent with moral language to say that she should save both of them, or sorry, save none of them, like just refuse to play, or pick one or pick the other. Like, I think all of that's consistent with our moral terminology. So when I hear like logically, I mean like entailed by the concepts themselves. But I think that there's a metaphysical truth that may not be entailed by the concepts, but it's entailed by the nature of rightness and wrongness about what Sophie ought to do in this case. And so I would just want to put it, when I hear, so I guess I'm making a fairly small point here, but logically necessary sounds like it flows from the very concepts and the very meaning of the term, versus metaphysical flows from the very nature of the object in question. And so I want to say that ethical truths flow from the nature of ethics. And so in that sense, are metaphysically necessary,
Awesome.
Even if not logically necessary.
Awesome. Yeah, I would agree with that distinction. So yeah, I was meaning the metaphysical necessity.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, so let's kind of change gears a little bit slightly here to moral epistemology. So great, you've kind of outlined some of the ontological views and where you kind of sit. But how do you think that, okay, well, great, how do we as human beings gain moral knowledge based on these your moral ontology? You know, what, and as part of that, obviously we've been talking about emotions. So what role do affective states like emotions or moods play in our coming to know the truth, moral truths and that sort of thing?
Yeah, great. So there's a lot I can say here, so feel free to interrupt me at any point.
Okay.
But the way I start thinking about this is by thinking about examples. So if you go back to the cat burning case that I was just talking about, so you have this awful case of these kids who are standing around, they're torturing this cat. And so we say, that's wrong. And if we know that anything is wrong, we know that's wrong. And the question is, but how do we know that that is wrong? And so on some views, it might be that we have some background knowledge of like ethical principles, and then we infer in this case on the basis of those principles that we know that torturing this cat is wrong. And then the question would arise, okay, how do we know those background principles? And there's another view, and it's compatible with this. You could think that it could work in both ways, where it's not that the person knows any background principles, but they just see in this case that torturing this cat is wrong, and they just know right then that that's the wrong thing to do, or at least they have a degree of justification for believing right there and then that it's wrong. And so some philosophers that tend to emphasize the first kind of case is where you have the background knowledge, tend to think that moral knowledge is in some way a priori. And philosophers who think that moral knowledge is primarily, first and foremost, a priori, tend to think that we get these knowledge of necessary moral propositions. So like where we were just both agreeing that there are these fundamental facts that hold with metaphysical necessity, the first thing you would know might be those kind of necessary moral propositions. And then you can infer to particular things in your world about them being right or wrong. And so philosophers who've taken this track in moral epistemology have often modeled moral knowledge on mathematical knowledge. So just as you can sort of sit around and contemplate the proposition, take the proposition that two circles have at most two intersecting points, something like that. And you sit around and think about that, okay, that seems true. And in the same way, you might sit around and think about moral propositions and they'll seem true to you, and that could ground, you could explain, have some story about how that's supposed to work, and that could ground knowledge of these metaphysical principles, and then you can infer to particular cases whether the action is in accordance with those principles or not. That's not the picture that I've been inclined to go with. I've been more attracted to a bottom-up picture, where there's kind of not a perfect symmetry between the way in which we know the moral facts and the nature of the moral facts themselves. So like we sort of slowly work our way towards the metaphysical necessities from seeing the particular things that are right or wrong. And so I've been attracted to the view, as you sort of just indicated, that emotions are playing an important role here. And not just emotions, but I would say also desires, pleasures, and pains, moods, but just sort of setting those aside for now, emotions, because I think that as we talked about earlier, emotions are a kind of perceptual experience of value, where value is just used broadly here to indicate rightness, wrongness, goodness, badness. And just as ordinary perceptual experiences are kind of the thing that gets the engine of empirical inquiry started. If we didn't have perceptual experiences, we couldn't, learn much about physics, say. In order to learn about ethics, we need some kinds of emotional experiences to get the process started. And that doesn't mean that we should just take our emotional experiences for granted. No, that'd be a disaster. In the same way that just taking our perceptual experiences would be a disaster in science if we just took them for granted. So we have these affective experiences, the nature of which is to be an experience of value. And so the person has a negative emotional response to the children torturing the cat. They get angry at them, say, and that indignation is an experience of what the kids are doing is wrong and can provide some initial justification for believing that what the kids are doing is wrong. And that won't be how all cases work. So sometimes, you'll be in a certain kind of mood where you don't have the emotional response, but from past experience that actions like this tend to be wrong on the basis of prior emotional experiences. And so I'm interested in developing this kind of view where it says like, okay, moral epistemology is hard. Can we get by and do moral epistemology with emotions as the base kind of moral experience that we work with, and then reason on the basis of having had these emotional responses to refine them and get closer to the truth. But yeah, I'll stop there for now and let you follow up.
Sure. Oh, all right, cool. So that's interesting. So for you, emotions are the primary way of coming to that knowledge, and then reasoning is sort of supplemental and that sort of thing. And that's fair characterization.
Yeah. So supplemental in the sense, in the same way that reasoning might be supplemental in the sciences. Mm. So playing a very central role, but if there weren't perceptual experiences, then we just wouldn't be able to get knowledge of how the world works. But at the same time, we'd have really crappy knowledge, or no knowledge at all, I guess would be a better way or very limited knowledge, if we didn't have reason either. So if we were just sort of taking our immediate emotional responses for granted, I think that would be a disaster. And so we have to kind of reflect on those responses to reason our way towards the truth. But if we didn't have, so if you imagine, and this is a very abstract kind of thought experiment, so I don't know how much leverage it can get, but if you imagine someone that has no emotional responses at all, right? So they don't feel any anger, fear, whatever. And they furthermore don't experience any pleasure, pain. They're just kind of affectless. They have no desires, no pleasure, pain, no emotions, no moods. Then my sort of intuition is that this person, if we can imagine them, no such creature has ever existed. It seems like from that perspective, nothing would seem to matter in the world at all to them. And so it seems to me like you need some kinds of affective responses to get the engine of inquiry started. But at the same time, I don't want to oversell this. Like I'm open to the possibility that there could be other ways of acquiring moral knowledge too, but it's so hard to make sense of one way of acquiring moral knowledge. I want to try to avoid that if I can.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think there is, like I kind of briefly mentioned, when I was doing my essay for you, I originally I wanted to go down this route, and there's an obvious connection in religious epistemology with people like William Alston, who believe in M beliefs or manifestation beliefs on things like, God is doing this for me or something like that. Mm-hmm. He brings up this notion of super warrant and stuff. So I see this as I see the attraction kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But ultimately I kind of disagree with that. And I prefer the top-down approach. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on my thesis that the audience will be familiar, because I did sort of a solo show presenting that view. And basically the main thing that I say is, look, I think you're right, that our emotions do play a role in helping us gain moral knowledge and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So that's a big, congratulations, that's a big change from who I was a few months ago and stuff. But I think that they're limited in scope. So my moral ontology, speaking just from a deontologist perspective for this question, I think that there are higher moral principles or values. Those are where it's metaphysically necessary, grounded in God's nature, principle of justice, principle of truth, principle of life preservation, stuff like that. And then moral duties derive from those. So I think our emotions track only the higher things, and they say, is the moral ideal? Are all these principles being upheld equally or not? They can't specify, is there an actual violation of a moral principle, which would mean this action is immoral or something like that, versus just saying, well, this isn't morally ideal, but maybe there's an exemption of the principle or something. So does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's an eminently reasonable position, and I think you like expanded in your paper in some really helpful ways on. I know you were partly building on the work of Andras Szigeti, and I think that you developed that kind of heuristicsy model of emotional experience in a helpful and plausible way. Yeah. One question is whether this isn't really like meant to be like too much of a challenge question, but just kind of a curiosity question. Are you thinking that the principles that are associated, these sort of higher principles that are associated with emotions, are manifest in the emotional experience themselves? Because I would sort of agree that emotions pattern in a way that accords broadly with certain principles. But what might seem a little bit weird to some philosophers is the idea that the emotion is giving us any awareness of direct awareness of those principles themselves, as opposed to the emotion kind of pattern in a way that accords with the principles. But then what is the fear response giving us in a given instance? It's giving us that whatever the target of the fear is dangerous.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Does that difference make sense?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. Yeah, I don't think our emotions directly are intentional or track moral values necessarily. It's more our moral conscience that produces our properly based belief that this is not the moral ideal or something like that. But our emotions kind of activate or trigger our moral conscience to produce that belief in a way that we become conscious of it. So that's, I don't know if that makes sense.
I see. So there's a role for conscience, which is separate from the emotions.
Yeah.
And then you were saying, so consciousness, the conscience fits in, where is it, after the emotion or before? Or?
Yeah, so I think, so it's kind of like an involved step. So when emotions are playing the role of a moral heuristic, and so our moral conscience is the first thing that's what's designed, the faculty designed to track the morality of a situation. And perhaps we're not fully conscious of it or something. So it produces what Diona and Tironi value intuition. Then that triggers the emotion kind of thing, and that focuses our attention on the moral situation, in which case our moral consciences can then respond to the emotion, and produce this full-on conscious, properly based belief or evaluation. So.
So there was that disagreement that you had with Diona and Tironi, I'm remembering now. So they want to say, like, these value feelings or these value intuitions that precede emotions, they thought that wasn't plausible, and then I think you thought that that their arguments there weren't persuasive, if I remember right, and you're sort of slotting the conscience into that role.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think it's definitely a plausible view. If you wanted to see, I wrote a paper that was called "Taking the Perceptual Analogy Seriously," where I tried to respond to some of these worries. Like, it's a paper that's about Andras Szigeti's paper in Ethical Theory of Moral Practice. It's in some ways similar to yours, where I try to respond to some things that he says. So that would be kind of my more detailed response. But I think that the way in which I'm inclined to respond is less by arguing that, like, your view is wrong, in some way, like arguing directly against it in that way. Just like I think that there's questions that we can raise about how this conscience works and where it comes from and so on, that are hard questions. And so then like my interest is like, okay, like, do we need that in our picture? Do we need it, or do we want it in our picture? And can we do sort of with the emotions, everything that we need to do, and then reason on the basis of those emotions? So I think that, you know, in your paper, you made a strong case that there are certain instances where we just can't rely on emotion. So then the trick for me would be to explain why in those cases we shouldn't rely on our emotions, but why that doesn't push us outside the emotions at the foundation altogether, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
Right. In the same way that we'll have perceptual experiences that we shouldn't rely on perception in that case, but that doesn't mean that our knowledge of how perception is going wrong in that case is not itself based on perception.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. And by the way, so you know, you are, even though it's my show, you are free to challenge me and say, Dale, you were wrong. To lunch. So, all right, cool. So let's I want to turn to not just moral knowledge. So one of the critiques that constructive criticism you gave me was to bring in this notion with my essay about moral development and emotional development and that sort of thing. So yeah, I just want to turn it to you. Do you think maybe taking a virtue ethics perspective, what role do emotions have in helping us refine our moral characters and that sort of thing, if any?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I've thought a little bit about this, but it's not. It's definitely not my area of expertise, the virtues. I've published one paper on the topic. But yeah, so I think that when it comes to most of the virtues, the character traits that we consider virtues, there's emotions that are at the center of those traits. So example, courage seems to have a lot to do with fear and the proper regulation of fear. There's arguably like a virtue of righteous indignation, and that has something to do with responses to injustice, and that primarily concerns regulation of anger in some kind of way. So with a lot of character traits, it seems that there's emotions that are at the center of them, and it's not just that the virtues are just about emotions, they're also about ways of thinking and acting, but that the proper regulation of emotion is at the center of them. And I think that there's feedback that goes in both directions. So we want to rationally refine our emotions, but at the same time, our emotions are providing inputs for reason to work with and to help us make decisions. And so there's a kind of back and forth between habituating our emotions in a certain way, but also getting input from our emotions to begin learning how we might want to refine our emotions as well. And so I think that emotions and emotion regulation are a big part of virtue. I also think that developing our emotions in a way such that we often bypass beliefs is something that might be important for virtue as well. So here I'm thinking of an example like the following. Philosophers have often talked about these cases. It might go back to Bernard Williams. That might be the originator of this example, but you might imagine, you know, your mother is like drowning, and you're sort of, what you should do is you should just feel this fear on behalf of your mother and just like immediately go and try to save your mother who's drowning. If you sort of have to go through this thought process of like, oh, my mother is drowning, and I believe that one ought to save their mother when their mother is drowning, so therefore I'll go save my mother. That seems like too many thoughts that are happening there to really be virtuous. And so I think that when someone really becomes virtuous, in a lot of cases, not necessarily all cases, but a lot of cases, they're just going to have their emotions be so refined that they just act directly on the basis of their emotion without having to rely on background beliefs about what's right or wrong. But yeah, so those are some initial thoughts, but yeah, there's a lot to say here. What are you thinking?
No, I think that answer is right. I do think that our emotions play a role in shaping and forming our moral characters and that sort of thing. There is that thing where it becomes, over time, these habits become ingrained into us so that our characters are reformed in that sort of thing. So yeah, I think I fully agree with what you said.
Yeah.
Cool. So, all right, we've got about 20 minutes, just respecting the time, because I know you've got stuff to do. So I want to ask this a couple interesting last questions. So the first one is regarding suffering. So we had Michael Brady come to our class and give sort of a talk. He's kind of an expert on suffering and emotional suffering, that sort of thing. But I wanted to ask you, what's your take on the role of emotional suffering? Does it play any role in our having wisdom or that sort of thing? What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I think that on the question of wisdom, I find myself agreeing with a lot of what Brady says. And so what he says, so start out with like a basic idea of what suffering is. So suffering is when you're having this intensely unpleasant experience, and furthermore, you want that experience to stop. You desire that experience to stop. So suffering is something like that. So you can, experiencing deep, intense grief could be a form of suffering potentially. So these intensely negative experiences that you want to cease. And I think that there can be wisdom that can be gained from these kinds of experience. So some simple ways in which that might work that Michael Brady talks about is that when you undergo intensely negative experiences, that can help you appreciate the positive experiences that you have in a way that you did previously. So, a lot of us are fortunate to live in climate-controlled homes and to have all the food that we need to eat. But if you undergo a period of being, let's say you are living on the streets, or less extreme, you lock yourself out of your apartment at night and you're sort of stuck outside for like 30 or 40 minutes, which is something I'm always scared I'm going to do here in Toronto. You might undergo some like suffering, and that can help you appreciate the value of a warm, temperature controlled house. So sometimes there could be suffering can clue you into the value of something, and that way help you gain wisdom about it. But there's also a thought that suffering can be a kind of transformative experience, a negative transformative experience. So philosophers, there's this idea of a transformative experience that's gotten a lot of play in recent philosophy, and the example that's often used is pregnancy and parenthood. So this idea that when you become a parent, or in the case of a person who's giving birth, like you go through this experience that's something that you couldn't possibly read about and learn what it's like in advance. You have to go through the process to see what it's like. And with parenthood, that may be like a positive transformative experience. It could also potentially be negative, but in many cases it's going to be positive. But you can't project from your past experience what that will be like. So there's this new value that's revealed to you only once you've gone through the experience. And suffering, I think, can also potentially be like that as well, where there it's a kind of negative experience. So like if you've not experienced starvation, like what it's like to be starving, then you probably can't just read about it and recognize, like you just can't think like, oh, I've been hungry before. What would it be like to be starving? Like, oh yeah, okay, I can see what that's like. No, it's like you plausibly have to go through that yourself. And so when people go through bouts of suffering, that can cue them into value in the broad sense that includes this value as well, that can help them to engage more meaningfully with other people who are suffering. And so there's a kind of wisdom that can be gained in going through experiences of suffering, because you just can't read about it. You just can't project from a history of not suffering in that way to know what it would be like to suffer. And Brady also talks about how, sorry, my phone is ringing in the background. But it's,
no worries.
Yeah, I'll get this. All right. So Brady also talks about the role of suffering in capturing and consuming our attention and leading us to reflect on values in ways that we might not have previously. So if someone's going through a bout of grieving that involves tremendous suffering, then that may lead them to reflect on the value, in this case, the the disvalue of like what's happened to them. And so suffering, just as emotions in general, just pull our attention to things and force us to, like, we think like, what is this thing that our emotion is so concerned with? And that could be, you could be lying, take a trite example, you could be lying in bed at night and hear weird noise in your house, and the fear prompts you to think, like, is there something that's dangerous that's happening here? But in the same way, like, suffering can also prompt us to think that, is there something bad that's happening here? What is the nature of that badness? And so it consumes your attention, forcing you to kind of think about the object of your suffering. And so those are three ways, right? So helping us to appreciate things that are good, a kind of transformative experience that's revealing a new value, disvalue, or a kind of capturing and consuming of our attention that's leading us to greater reflection on certain value. And I think that Brady is right about each one of those things.
That's interesting. I do have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Not to make it too personal, so if you don't want to answer it, go ahead. But I'm just wondering, in light of what you said at the beginning, you mentioned that you went through a period of suffering, and now you feel sort of a disconnect to religious and stuff like that. Do you think anything that you know now in terms of what you just said about suffering could be applies at all to your situation there? Or?
Yeah, I think that it does potentially explain why, like, at least certain bits of behavior that I engage in. So, like, it was a weird experience because it was like, in a certain sense, I didn't have control over my beliefs. And I don't think that we have voluntarily control over our beliefs, but like, it was just like, it shook a belief that was very central to me, and that I sort of lost control over that belief. So like, even readings, like, one of the things that I did was I took like classes in philosophy of religion, and then I would reflect on like the arguments in that class, and I could find myself, finding an argument plausible. But it was weird because it was almost like it didn't matter. It was like beyond the point of being where I was sensitive to rational considerations. And of course, I think that one ideally should be sensitive to rational considerations and their beliefs. But yeah, there was something about the place that belief occupied that made it a bit insensitive to rational considerations, which pushed me into a state of kind of, I guess you would call it, agnosticism. And it did lead me to, that suffering to think like, okay, maybe I can go back to church and sort of try to rekindle something, or pray and try to rekindle something. And so it did lead me to, like, really, I think, fixate on that, and to actually do a lot of things that I thought might rejuvenate. And in this case, it didn't happen to do that. But I think that Brady is right that it did lead me to engage in certain practices that involve greater reflection on the value of what was lost, and also, like, led me to think about what it would be like to live in a world that didn't have that belief. And that was something that I deeply struggled with as well. And so I think that, yeah, I think what he sort of indicates about suffering matches up to my own experience in those respects.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. Awesome. So I think that does lead to the last question. I know this is something that you're very excited to talk about, the issue of hope. For Christians in the audience, this is something you guys appreciate as well. So yeah, just want to get your take on the issue of hope. What's the contemporary theorizing about that issue? Is hope an emotion? Yeah. What's your take on hope?
Yeah, so I tend to theorize hope as continuous with emotions, and partly that's because I think that hope is partly constituted with a desire, and we haven't talked much about this, but I actually think desires are fairly continuous with emotions, regardless of what many philosophers of the emotions say. Yeah, so in the Christian tradition, hope is spoken of in two ways. And so one way is as a kind of passion, and the other way is as a virtue. And so, for example, Augustine defined hope as a kind of love for a future good that is desirable and possible to attain, but he says, not yet present or possessed. And that's from Enchiridion or Handbook on Faith, Hope, and Love. Right, so you've got love for a future good is desirable, possible to attain, but you don't yet have it. And I think that's basically right. I think I might quibble about the future thing. I think we can have hopes that are kind of oriented to the past. So I think basically what he's saying is right. So like we have a hope oriented to the past, for example, like Dale, I could say like, I hope Dale had a good day yesterday. And I don't know whether you had a good day yesterday, but I hope you did. And so in that sense, the hope is oriented to the past. But basically what I think Augustine is saying here is right. And so a lot of contemporary theorizing about hope kind of builds on the Christian tradition in thinking about hope's nature and then like, refines it around the edges. But there's also this really central idea in the Christian tradition of hope as a virtue. And that's something that I think has interestingly not been theorized as much, or when it has been theorized, it's been theorized in a way that's radically different from how the Christian tradition theorized it. So there's one really interesting paper by a philosopher, his name is Adam Cadillac, on the virtue of hope. And he sort of sees like hope, he sees hope as a virtue, but in a way that doesn't, it's very different from like the way Christians would have thought of the virtue of hope. It's just like hoping can be virtuous even if it's like an immoral hope on his view. And so it's theorized as a virtue in a way that's very separate from the tradition, Christian tradition. But it seemed to me that it's always been this interesting puzzle of like, well, in the Christian tradition, you have the virtues of faith, hope, and love, which are central theological virtues. But everyone hopes, or at least most people hope. And so you might think that, well, if there's this virtue that regulates hoping that Christians have identified, then you might think like, well, shouldn't there be a virtue of hope that could be sort of characterized more generally? Like, why would there be only virtuous hoping, or only a virtue of hope within this one context? Wouldn't there be a way to think about that virtue that wasn't essentially bound to the Christian framework, even if the Christians were going to think that's the right way to think about it? But shouldn't there be a way that people who are not Christian or not religious would also think about that virtue? So one thing that I've been interested in is like whether we can sort of characterize something like a Christian virtue of hope that isn't essentially tied to the divine. And so I've written a paper that's called Discovering the Virtue of Hope, which is in part meant to build on some things that Augustine says to characterize the virtue of hope in a kind of structural way that can be filled with a Christian framework, or with a framework that's not necessarily Christian. But part of the gist of that paper is that Augustine has hit on something that's structurally important about virtue, and that includes like this virtue of hope. So a lot of theorizing about hope in the contemporary philosophical literature has been, what is hope consist in? What is its nature? And I can definitely talk more about that. It often starts from the idea of hope as involving a desire for something and a belief that what you desire is uncertain, and then trying to figure out what more is required. But then, yeah, this question of virtue, I think, has been underexplored in secular philosophy. But I think that's a mistake, because I think that the Christian tradition has hit on something that's deeply important about the nature of virtue in general. And so that's something that I've been thinking about a little bit. But I've talked for a bit, so I'll let you follow up and take it in whichever direction you'd like.
Yeah, no, I find it fascinating, kind of thing, especially finding out, okay, there are those two aspects. The first aspect seems to define the nature of debate, even in secular philosophy, but not much the second notion of it being a virtue. So I think it's great work that you're kind of bringing that in, but also looking at it not even from a theistic perspective. What can hope as a virtue mean in secular philosophy? So that's pretty cool.
And I should say that there are certain, like in the Christian tradition, part of the reason hope is a theological virtue is because you're not supposed to have, like, you're supposed to rely on God's grace to achieve the virtue. And so in that sense, it wouldn't be possible for like a non-Christian to have the virtue. And also the content of the hope in the Christian tradition is going to be partly oriented to salvation. But then kind of the question is like, okay, like that's a Christian framework, but is there another framework that doesn't have the Christian content, but that still builds on the insights, the structural insights? And one other just point, like, that I can't help but make, is that in Aquinas's work, the virtue of hope, very surprisingly, does not directly regulate the passion of hope. And I think that this leads to a little bit of weirdness in how Aquinas's view sometimes gets talked about. But the virtue of hope is not a way of hoping that something is the case, but it's more a way of hoping in God as a way of an act of the will of relying on God to achieve certain things. And so that's why for Aquinas, the vice of despair is sort of thinking that you can't rely on God for salvation. So sort of seen as impossible, which is misguided. And the vice of presumption, which is where hope is in the middle, the vice of presumption is sort of thinking you can do it on your own. But so that's how he's thinking of the virtue of hope as an act of will of relying on God in the right way for salvation. But then the passion of hope is actually regulated by a different virtue that he calls magnanimity. So there's kind of this weird structure to Aquinas' picture. And that's why I build in my work more on an Augustinian framework, because I think that there's more an intimate connection between the virtue of hope in Augustine's picture as being an account of rightly ordered passions of hope.
Interesting. Awesome. All right. Yeah, that does it for my list of questions. I know we've got a few minutes left, so yeah, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much for coming on. So, did you enjoy yourself on your end?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, this has been fun. I mean, it's been, I've been thinking about a lot about hope for the last handful of years, and I've published a lot of stuff on hope. But it's really great to get back and talk about some of this meta-ethics stuff, especially, and that's where my research is hopefully going to be going in the next few years, is diving back into some of those things that originally gripped me so much. If there's anything more I can say to clarify anything, I'm happy to do that.
Awesome.
Got a couple minutes, but that's up to you.
Yeah, no, with the last few minutes, I'd be happy to just open it up to you. Like, is there anything that you haven't said that you feel is really important for you to share with the audience? Or
yeah, so let's see. I'm sure that there's been plenty of holes in all the things that I've said. So if anything stands out to you that I can fill in for in the last moment, I'm happy to do that. One thing that I would like to say about hope is to kind of illustrate, just because I think it's kind of a fun puzzle about the nature of hope. So, because I feel like I didn't say enough about this. So here's kind of the big puzzle that drives contemporary theorizing about the nature of hope. So philosophers think, like, look, when you hope for something, you desire the thing that you hope for. So like if you didn't want the thing to happen, then you couldn't possibly hope for it. But at the same time, if you were certain that something were going to happen, then you also couldn't hope for it. So like we don't hope that the sun will rise tomorrow because we're certain that the sun will rise. It'd be weird to say that we hope that the sun will rise, unless we had some reason to doubt it. But it seemed to a lot of philosophers that there has to be more to hope than this. So take the following example. Suppose you've got these two partners, married couple, and one of them buys a lottery ticket, and they're hoping that they win the lottery, and they desire it, and they believe it's possible that they'll win the lottery. And the other partner doesn't hope that they'll win, even though they believe it's possible and they desire it. They think it's just ridiculous that their partner has bought this lottery ticket. They don't have any hope that they'll win. Or imagine, the movie Shawshank Redemption, where you've got Andy and Red who are in jail together, and Andy believes that escape is possible. he desires escape. Red also desires escape, and he believes it's technically possible, but Red experiences despair and rather than hope. And so it seems like you can desire something and believe it's possible, but be in a state of despair, not a state of hope.
Gotcha.
And so then this question arises, what is the special thing that makes hope hope? Like what's the last ingredient that we need to add to the picture that completes the story about hope? And so this is, the puzzles I gave were from Ariel Myrov and Luke Bovens, just to give the references. But yeah, it's like, what's the thing that's the special final ingredient to hope? I think is kind of the interesting puzzle that's driven in the last 10 years, like paper after paper, trying to figure out that final ingredient of hope, which I think is perhaps an important question for us today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And especially for the Christians in the audience, hope is an essential thing, right? Faith, love, and hope. So yeah, that's
yeah. Oh, and one final thought related to Christianity. I think this kind of this is a puzzle that was initially presented to me by a philosopher named Luke Bovens. But I think there's an interesting question of like, if you have this hope for salvation in the Christian framework, and hope requires uncertainty, then this question arises like, are you supposed to be uncertain about it? Like what should kind of the Christian form of hope look like, given that there should be, on some accounts, a kind of faith in salvation, which I think is kind of and different Christians will answer that question in different ways. And I think it's kind of an interesting question to pose.
Definitely. Yeah. I'm getting some ideas perhaps for a future show. If you'd be up for that, I can arrange a show sometime in the summer on hope specifically.
Sure. Yeah. Be down for that.
All right, cool. All right. Yeah. So awesome. So thank you so much for being on. I thoroughly enjoyed this. And was happy to share this knowledge with my audience, because it's not something that is really out there, especially in religious discussion and that sort of thing. So I think it was a thing to cover. So I guess just for the audience, so you know what I've got coming up next week, in 2 weeks, I've got Dr. Liz Jackson, who Mike's familiar with. She's going to be coming on to have a kind of a discussion with my former skeptical co-host David Johnson on religious epistemology, as well as Pascal's wager, which is something she's well known for. So that's what to look out for next time. And have a great week, everybody. Have a great one there, Mike.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.